More than 50 games and counting, thousands of hours of playtime, and a goal to definitively rank them all. Hey everyone, thanks so much for tuning in to part 4 of my quest to play every single Legend of Zelda game that has ever been released, including spin-offs. In this video, we're covering games 31 to 40, which definitely includes a few weird ones. Timestamps for all of the different games we covered down in the description below. And since we have a lot of ground to cover, let's just jump right into this, starting with game number 31. Now we're covering the final Tingle-focused spin-off that was released on the Nintendo DS, Ripened Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love. This is a point-and-click adventure game, and it was never actually localized outside of Japan. A group of very dedicated people released a full fan translation patch for the game, and that's what I'll be playing for this review. So this game starts off with the character soon to be known as Tingle alone in his bedroom watching TV. An advertisement pops up for a book about the amazing adventures of a green-clad hero, and after finding out that it's been discounted to just 2 rupees, he purchases it for himself. After he signs for the delivery and ignores the warning barks of his dog, he then opens the book and is sucked into the world therein. In the world of the book, he meets a grandmother character who refers to him by the name Tingle and then gives him the notorious green outfit. She then sets him off on his way, which involves shooting him out of a cannon. You come across a fortune teller who predicts that you will be joined on your quest by 3 different companions, and that ultimately it will culminate with you dancing with the princess at the castle. This game is basically a parody / homage to The Wizard of Oz, but instead of Dorothy, it's Tingle. Along the way, you team up with a little scarecrow, a robot woman, and also a cowardly lion. You also walk the yellow brick road, although hilariously a farmer actually tore part of it up to build his house. There's several different witches who are involved in your journey, and you're traveling to the Emerald City. Visually, this game is extremely similar to Tingle's Rosy Rupee Land. I would say that this game looks a bit better than its predecessor, with slightly clearer graphics and more well-defined locations. Being that this is a point-and-click adventure, it has an extremely chill vibe. You're very much able to just take your time and explore at your leisure. Control-wise, Tingle is moved around entirely by clicking on locations, objects, and characters with the stylus on the bottom screen. You use the stylus for pretty much everything in this game, although there is one section where you play an arcade game and you can actually purchase a joystick that lets you use the D-pad. You're also constantly searching for items to add to your inventory, which can then be used to solve the various problems and puzzles later down the line. The 3 companions that you gather along the way also all have special abilities that you can call on. For example, the lion is able to lift very heavy objects, or the robot is able to scan or kick things. And this type of game works surprisingly well on the DS, better than I ever would have expected. This game is played almost entirely on the bottom screen, with the top screen mainly showing your map, total rupees, and where you are in the story. And structurally, this game is broken up into 14 different sections that are called pages, which leans into the overall storybook aesthetic. Each of the different pages that you play through varies in length, but to this game's credit, they never really overstay their welcome. And each chapter within the page always gives you a completely new objective, which means that the gameplay always had a pretty nice variety to it. That being said, this game really takes its time to get you to your final destination. There are constantly antagonists derailing your efforts and throwing a wrench into your methods of travel, and a lot of this title can pretty much get summed up as getting sidetracked the game. One key mechanic that gets introduced a little less than halfway into the game is giving gifts to the various girls that you meet. Each of these girls has a heart meter, and giving them the right gifts will fill up that meter, while giving them the wrong ones will decrease it. When the meter fills up completely, new dialogue options and opportunities will open up. Some specific characters do have multiple hearts, and some are even locked at the start and require special conditions to unlock them. Also introduced later in the story is a mechanic that lets you travel to the previous pages using your balloon, with new dialogue options and characters appearing when you return to these old places. Towards the end of the game, this mechanic is used heavily, and you need to do this very frequently just to be able to progress in the story. When you do finally make it to the Emerald City, you then save the princess who has been poisoned, and she invites you to the dance party, but one of the recurring antagonists of this game then dresses up as your party and commits crimes, which gets Tingle and company thrown in jail. After doing some time hopping so that the guard woman will actually let you out of your cell, you make your way to the ballroom, with each character in your party actually sacrificing themselves to allow Tingle to progress. When Tingle finally does get a chance to dance with the princess, it's revealed that the entire journey has actually been a ruse planned by an evil woman named Witch, who intends to drain Tingle's life force to keep herself young. After reuniting with your party, defeating Witch, and once again saving the princess, the entire group gets very high praise from the king before it is revealed that Tingle must return to his world, and the time to do so is upon them. The game concludes with Tingle picking a final girl to dance with, and you're then given the choice of either staying or returning to his own world. And the game actually has multiple possible endings depending on which choices you make here. There's also a bunch of post post-game content that you can do involving different side quests and the like if you're so inclined, but otherwise that's pretty much the game. Ripen Tingle's Balloon Trip of Love was significantly better than I was expecting. While the gameplay typically isn't super exciting or engaging, it worked extremely well on the DS. And the fact that they constantly switched things up made sure that it never got boring. There were lots of moments when playing this that stuck with me, and one of this game's strongest aspect is its characters. They are all extremely well developed and show actual character growth over time, especially your party members. That being said, I do think it was a 4-hour story packaged into a 20-hour game. There's tons of backtracking, especially near the end, and it's very unclear what you need to do in a lot of places. So with all of that in mind, this game gets a very high C rank. You do have to like point-and-click adventure games for this one to connect with you, and because Tingle is the star, it's not going to feel like a normal Zelda game, but if you can get past all that, there's actually a pretty fun experience here. All that being said though, I am glad to finally be done with all of the Tingle spin-offs. They are definitely all of their time, and while I think the developers of this game and also Rosie Rupee Land mostly did a good job embodying what a Tingle game should be, I don't really think he needs to be the main star of any other titles moving forward. And now we're continuing with Zelda titles on the DS, covering the direct sequel to the Phantom Hourglass, The Legend of Zelda Spirit Tracks. This game is extremely similar to its predecessor, except instead of revolving around sailing the ocean like in Wind Waker, this time you're driving a train on various railroad tracks spread out across the land. Spirit Tracks starts off with an ancient Nico from Tetra's pirate crew telling the newest iteration of Link a story about how a Demon King was trapped below the earth. Link then sets off to the castle to attend a graduation ceremony and become an official train engineer, although after he arrives, he gets belittled and the ceremony is interrupted multiple times by a nefarious chancellor in Zelda's court. Zelda then has Link help her escape the castle to visit a tower not far away. Chancellor Cole ambushes your party on the way there, revealing himself to be a demon, and then Zelda's spirit is literally knocked loose from her body, after which they carry away her lifeless body. Zelda comes to as a disembodied spirit, and Link is one of the few people who can actually see and hear her, so once again he takes her to the Tower of Spirits, and here you meet the sage Anjean, who reveals that if all of the spirit tracks disappear across the land, then the Demon King will be resurrected. By meeting with specific denizens throughout the world, the tracks can actually be restored, so Link sets off on a journey to accomplish this, accompanied by Zelda's spirit. Aesthetically, the game looks very similar to the Phantom Hourglass, both in the character designs and backgrounds. Zelda in particular is very well fleshed out. She feels more like an actual character in Spirit Tracks than she does in a lot of the mainline Zelda games. It also has an extremely similar control scheme, with Link being moved around entirely by the stylus. You also have to physically blow into the microphone a lot in this game, usually to play an instrument or use a specific item, and while on occasion this did still feel pretty gimmicky, overall it was better implemented and more like a core game mechanic. Spirit Tracks also has a very similar formula to Phantom Hourglass, with you going out and completing a dungeon and then returning to a main temple hub, where you then clear through new floors to unlock the next piece of map for you to explore, which will lead to the next dungeon, rinse and repeat. That being said, I do vastly prefer the Spirit Tower in this game over the Temple of the Ocean King. Each time that you complete a part of the story and have to return, you can skip right ahead to the new floors you need to complete without having to redo the previous ones over and over. This minor tweak vastly improved this concept for me. The main method of travel in this game is your train, which does feel pretty similar to Linebeck's ship from the Phantom Hourglass. You still plan out a route to traverse using the stylus in the map, but this time you can only travel along preset railroads. At any junction in the road, you can actually deviate from your set course without needing to stop or redraw your route. You're also able to adjust your speed or go in reverse while actively traveling. The train eventually gets outfitted with a cannon, and later on you also get an additional cart to transport goods around. It can also be customized with different parts, which will change how it looks and increase its overall health. I cannot stress enough just how slow it is to go from place to place in this game. Even on the fastest setting, the train feels like it's moving through molasses. They also fill up the tracks with enemies and obstacles that you have to constantly maneuver around, like these evil trains that can one-shot kill you. About halfway through the game, they also introduce escorting passengers to different locations using your train, but while doing so, you need to obey road signs and make sure that you don't get hit by enemies, which makes everything take even longer. Transporting goods is also annoying as they disappear over time, either due to temperature or when you take damage. So while I think the train is a unique concept and it does a lot of interesting things, I started dreading every every time I had to travel anywhere in this game. This game also features a ton of collectibles, from the standard stuff like heart pieces, capacity upgrades, and different items, to some unique stuff like stamping Nico's notebook at train stations and having to catch a plethora of rabbits throughout the world. Another area that this game has definitely improved on, however, is the dungeon design. Most of the dungeons felt like they took advantage of Link's gear and items much more fully this time around. The bosses as well are something that this game really excelled at, with almost every dungeon boss being fun and unique and sometimes a legitimate challenge. Eventually, it is revealed that the henchman working with Zelda's former chancellor was actually Anjean's apprentice. The two face off and Anjean is defeated off screen, and when you return to the tower, Byrne is now the boss. You defeat him but fail to stop Malladus from being resurrected in Zelda's body, and the Demon King and Chancellor Cole then take off together in the demon train. Anjean reveals that when the Demon King was originally sealed, the Bow of Light was used to defeat him, and so you go on a quest to a final temple to retrieve this item. Byrne reveals that there is a compass of light in the Spirit Temple that will help you locate the demon train, so you then have to clear this temple one last time to claim that. Once you have the compass, you can then travel to the Dark World, where using Tears of Light you can finally destroy those trains that have been harassing you the entire game, and you can also travel super fast while doing it. Good God, I wish this was the speed of the train in the rest of the game. You then fight the demon train itself before trying to reach Malladus on top of it in a rather annoying fight. You strike him with a light arrow, separating his soul from Zelda's body, and then Malladus possesses Cole instead, and the two of you face off against him in a form pretty reminiscent of Ganon. After protecting Zelda so that she can charge up her sacred power, you distract the Demon King while she shoots him in the back with light arrows, reminding me a lot of Wind Waker. After managing to stun Malladus, Zelda and Link together drive the Locomo blade into his head, destroying him for good. Anjean then decides to return to the heavens, telling Zelda and Link that humanity will be fine on their own without the guidance of the spirits anymore. And after this, the credits roll. So Spirit Tracks definitely feels like an improvement on the Phantom Hourglass in almost every way. The controls were tighter, the items were more unique, the temples and puzzles were a lot more fun, as were the minigames, and there were so many more characters that stood out and were full of personality. I also think that the plot is stronger in this title as well, although it's still pretty standard Legend of Zelda fare. This game's biggest downfall though was its lengthy traveling sections, which made up more than half of the runtime. With all of that in mind, Spirit Tracks still gets a D rank. The incredibly lengthy and dull train sections really killed this one for me, alongside controls that still feel awkward in a lot of cases. If they ever decide to remake this one with an updated control scheme and increased speed options for the train, I would probably jump on it in a heartbeat, since I do think that there's a good game hidden somewhere within here. But unless that happens, this is yet another title in the series that I'd probably recommend skipping. Nintendo has always been pretty good about letting fans have access to the older Zelda titles, either through compilation discs, making them available on the eShop, or more recently on the Nintendo Switch Online service. And while occasionally we would see an updated re-release of some of their 2D games, like Link's Awakening DX on the Game Boy Color, this was not something they had really experimented with yet for their 3D titles up to this point. That all changed with this release, Ocarina of Time 3D for the Nintendo 3DS, which would set off a chain reaction of a bunch of the old 3D classic Zelda games getting remastered and remade. After having already experienced what was done down the line with some of the more impressive re-releases like Wind Waker HD, I'm actually pretty excited to see what this game has to offer. The story is once again the same as it has always been. Link, a normal human child who was entrusted into the care of the Kokiri, gets a fairy companion named Navi, and then soon after is tasked with saving the world. Link meets Princess Zelda, who tells him of a vision she had where Ganon attempts to take over and destroy the world. Link goes on a quest to stop Ganon, but their quest plays exactly into his hands, allowing Ganon into the Sacred Realm when Link opens the door to seize power for himself. Link is then frozen in time, waking up in a dark and desolate future where Ganon is king. And then our hero goes on another quest to free the various sages of the land and locate Princess Zelda, using their combined powers to overthrow Ganon once and for all. Link is then sent back to the past so that he can get to experience his childhood, which sets up multiple different timelines in the Zelda franchise. So first off, graphically, this game looks pretty good. The pre-rendered backgrounds from the original have actually been fully modeled out and look significantly better, and even small touches like lighting coming from windows or the particle effects really pop. I do find, however, that the graphics are a little bit too bright, which can ruin the moodiness of the original game. The 3D effect is interesting, and while occasionally I'd turn it on just to see if it added anything to the experience, I had it off for the majority of this playthrough. After having spent some time with this game, I do think that pretty much everything controls better than the original across the board by just a little bit. When you're aiming down the sights of weapons like like the bow or slingshot, you can use this tilt function to enhance your aim. For the most part, this worked flawlessly. One small disappointment though is that you can't freely control the camera with the second thumbstick on the 3DS, which was a feature I had been really hoping would be implemented. Your inventory and gear are now entirely located on the bottom screen of the 3DS, and so is a map that's constantly up when you're running around. I do think that delegating a lot of the UI did help with the immersion and gives it a very minimalistic feel. All this being said, you do lose out on a few buttons compared to the N64 controller, but they make up for this by adding 2 virtual buttons to the bottom screen that you can press, which works fine for things you don't use very often like quest items. There's also now a dedicated button for the ocarina and for Navi when she wants to talk. Another small tweak that I do really appreciate is how the iron boots and hover boots are now standard equipable items, meaning that you don't have to constantly go into your inventory to take them on and off. On the flip side though, I did find the ocarina less intuitive to play. As to make up for the lack of C buttons, you now use the shoulder buttons of the 3DS, and it just doesn't really feel like the new control scheme for it fits the original design. I also definitely think they made Navi even more annoying in this version, as she will often stop you to ask if you need to take a break from playing, or tell you to consult a Sheikah stone if you're having difficulty even if you're clearly doing fine. Speaking of, one of these few new additions to the game is these Sheikah guide stones, which you can find near Link's house or in the Temple of Time. And if you're ever stuck in the game, they'll show you a quick hint on how to progress. The temples themselves have undergone a few minor changes, for example color coding different areas in the water temple to make raising and lowering the water a lot more obvious, or slightly tweaking some puzzles here and there. I still really like that all of the sages you help in the temples are all characters that you meet as a child, which really motivates you to help them out as an adult. One of the new content additions is that Master Quest is now actually an unlockable reward that you get for beating the base game. It's pretty much the same as the Master Quest I played previously. The main changes from the original game are that you take double damage in Master Quest, as well as all of the dungeons have been remixed. They also pulled a Twilight Princess for this version though, and made the world completely mirror flipped. I do still think that Master Quest overall is weaker than regular Ocarina of Time, but I do like that this time around it's framed as a bonus for beating the main game. There's also now a boss rush mode that you can try out. If you return to Link's house, you can interact with his bed to fight any bosses you've previously fought in the game. In these fights, you're given a standard set of items, but not necessarily the same ones you had when you originally fought the boss. The game tracks how many times you've beaten each boss, as well as your record time for doing so. You can also attempt a gauntlet mode made up of all of the bosses back to back with very limited hearts and items, but unfortunately you don't really get anything for completing either of these challenges. So while this remake isn't bad by any stretch of the imagination, I do feel like there was a lot more they could have done with it. If you're going to completely modernize the look and feel of a game, some of the more outdated aspects like the combat should probably get the same treatment, otherwise they stick out like a sore thumb compared to everything else. None of the extra content they added like the boss rush mode or the unlockable Master Quest really did much for me, but one of the great things is that all of that is entirely optional, so if you don't like it, you can just ignore it. While I definitely don't think this remake is worse than the original game, I'd say it's more or less equal to it, with a handful of small tweaks that managed to put it just slightly above it. So with all of that in mind, it does still get an S rank. The one thing to keep in mind is that the gap in quality between the original and the 3DS version of Ocarina is nowhere near as large as it is when it comes to some of the later remakes, so definitely hedge your expectations going into this one and you'll still have a great time. Now we're jumping into Skyward Sword, which came out on the Wii and is one of the most divisive games in the entire series. Skyward Sword starts off with Link being awoken from a nightmare by Zelda's Loftwing, which is a giant bird that the denizens of the land above the clouds use for transport. After a pretty heavy-handed tutorial, you then meet Zelda and soon learn that your Loftwing is actually missing, having been captured by one of Link's rivals, Groose. After you free your bird, you then compete in an aerial competition, after which Zelda congratulates you and gifts you with her sailcloth. While on a trip around the sky with Zelda to celebrate, she gets sucked into a giant whirlwind and is transported down to the surface world below. The spirit Fi calls to Link from the statue of the goddess, and he goes there and draws a very important sword. With some help from the village chieftain and equipped in a fancy new set of clothes, Link then travels down to the surface world to try and find Zelda, with Fi helping him along the way. Skyward Sword has a pretty unique aesthetic, reminding me in a lot of ways of an oil painting. It's one of the few titles in the series where visually it still stands out because the look hasn't really been recreated since. The characters in the game all look very good and have a wide array of personalities. The Zelda and Link relationship was probably the best in the series since Spirit Tracks, and it actually paints them as believable childhood friends and possibly more. This title commits very hard to a control scheme entirely centered around motion controls. You draw Link's sword by swinging the Wiimote, and then the angle and direction that you hold the Wiimote in determines the direction of his sword on screen, which allows you to swipe up, horizontally, etc. Most enemies can only be attacked from a certain direction, requiring you to be adjusting your sword's angle at all times. And there's also puzzles that use your sword like a pointer and also use the motion in different ways, as well as various items you acquire that are also controlled by the Wiimote, like the beetle. Generally speaking, the motion controls worked okay. I definitely did struggle with them at times, especially when it came to combat. The game would regularly not register my sword swings correctly, or it would register me swinging the sword when I was just returning it to a neutral position. Horizontal attacks were the bane of my existence. Skyward Sword also does feature several mechanics that have been built upon in later titles. For example, breakable shields and upgradable gear, which is very similar to what you come across in Breath of the Wild. And also, just like those games, Skyward Sword also features a stamina gauge, but unfortunately you're not able to upgrade it in this game, and it runs out very quickly. You get plenty of pretty standard Legend of Zelda items like the bow and arrow or bombs, but there are some that are very unique to this game, and there's a bunch of items from 2D Zelda games returning here in 3D for the first time. Most of these items did feel pretty good to use, although aiming your weapons never felt as fluid to me as it did in Link's crossbow training. After you first get your sword, you're joined by the spirit Fi, who plays an integral role to the plot. Her personality is basically that of a computer, rattling off percentages and constantly telling you where to go. I also didn't love the fact that Fi will often jump out of your sword to point you in the next direction or reiterate things that you already know. I found this really destroys the flow of the game, and despite having a very cool design and getting some pretty great moments, in the overall hierarchy of Legend of Zelda companion / guide characters, she'd be at the very bottom for me. When you're out and about in the land below the clouds, you'll come across these bird statues, which in addition to being how you save the game, also allow you to teleport back up into the sky. You actually spend quite a bit of time in the sky flying around on your loft wing, completing various minigames, hunting down collectible chests, and visiting different locations to do side quests. Flying definitely got a bit tedious at times, and there was no fast travel mechanic unfortunately. Using the wide array of items that you obtain led to some pretty interesting puzzles, and while none of the dungeons are particularly memorable in my opinion, there's also none that were a huge pain to get through. One of the few that I will say stood out is the Skyloft Temple towards the end of the game, because it has a layout that's very reminiscent of a traditional 2D Zelda dungeon, and being able to rearrange the rooms actually reminded me of what was done later in the Switch version of Link's Awakening. There was a nice variety when it came to the boss fights, with them often requiring a lot of experimentation to figure out what you needed to do, and while there were a couple that were more annoying than fun, the majority of them were pretty solid. That being said, there is one boss called the Imprison that you have to fight 3 separate times, and I definitely got tired of that. Partway through the game, you find Zelda and protect her while she tries to escape, and she gives you her harp. And after this point, the game actually lost a lot of its momentum for me. Instead of having a tangible objective, you're now collecting tears in an alternate world 3 separate times, backtracking through old areas to get new items, doing different quests for an NPC in these areas, and then clearing through yet another dungeon, rinse and repeat. Eventually, after all of that running around, you do open the Gate of Time and travel even further back to when the goddess Hylia defeated a demon called Demise. Zelda reveals that she is actually the goddess reincarnated in human form, and that she used Link as a means to an end to defeat Demise for good. And you're then back to doing more of the same, traveling to a bunch of different points spread out through the world to try and finally get the Triforce. And he uses it to banish Demise from the world completely. However, the Demon Lord's lackey Girahim appears and kidnaps Zelda, jumping through the time portal intending to resurrect Demise in the past. Even though you defeat Girahim, by consuming Zelda's soul, Demise is still able to be resurrected. And he's one of the coolest and most intimidating antagonists I've ever seen in the Zelda franchise. And this boss fight was no joke. It was definitely the hardest fight in the entire game. After you defeat him, Demise curses you and the entire line of heroes that an incarnation of his hate will always follow in their stead, before he finally perishes and is sealed inside the Master Sword. Link and Zelda then share a tearful reunion, and Fi is sealed back within the Master Sword, with Link returning it to the pedestal before the group returns to the present where the sword is still resting peacefully. And the final moments of the credits close out showing the different areas that you visited on your journey, before showing the people of Skyloft now visiting the surface where Link and Zelda are deciding what to do with their future. Skyward Sword does have a lot of redeeming qualities. The world you get to explore has a fair amount of variety to it, and so many of the characters that you interact with are all great and memorable. Plenty of them show actual character growth over time, like Groose. Skyward Sword also has a fair bit of humor, and it's a very ambitious plot, with the story being one of my favorites in the entire series. That being said though, the game really does slow down to a crawl about a third of the way through it, and it never really recovers from this, and the extremely inconsistent control scheme was a source of frustration constantly throughout the entire journey. This game teeters on the line between a B and a C rank for me, but in this case, I think I'll have to give it a very low B rank. There are just too many things working against this title for it to be really high up there for me. When everything aligns and is working as intended, this game is a lot of fun, but unfortunately that happens a lot less than I would have liked. This is another one where I'm pretty excited to see what the remaster has to offer, since I think a traditional control scheme would actually help ease a lot of the frustrations that I had with it and make it a much more pleasant experience to play through overall. So next up, we're covering Four Swords Anniversary Edition. This version is stuffed with a bunch of new content to celebrate 25 years of Zelda. This was originally released for the Nintendo DS as a downloadable only title, and then it came to the 3DS store as well. Both times it was delisted from these stores after less than a year. Now that both eShops are completely shut down and no physical version was ever released, playing this game is a bit of an ordeal. So the biggest feature of this game that they changed was the addition of a single player mode. Otherwise, the core gameplay is the same, and you can still play it multiplayer, at least in theory. Because of the fact that I already beat the multiplayer in the original version and there's no difference between the two, I just did a full single player playthrough. The only thing in the entire game that you miss out on by doing single player and not multiplayer is those medals that you get for being the player with the most rupees. I find it very interesting how well they adapted something designed to be a multiplayer experience into a single player game. The way they got around this is you also control a second Link that you can swap to or move around. And because you control another character, you can still throw them across gaps or use them to solve puzzles. And generally speaking, this worked okay. Occasionally, this second Link that you control will actually have a mind of its own. For example, if you move boulders, it will snap into place, or if you fight certain enemies. This can be a little bit off-putting until you get used to it, but again, it just makes it so that you're able to easily overcome these obstacles. All that being said, it is definitely significantly harder to play the game in single player than it is to do it in multiplayer. And my biggest complaint with the single player is actually the player swapping mechanic itself. So if you press this button once, the other Link will go prone, and if you press it a second time, you'll swap to them. You also have a whistle that will summon the other Link to your side no matter where they are. Regardless of which Link blows the whistle, you will automatically swap to the default Link instead of continuing to play as whichever Link you were. This can be really annoying when you have different items on each Link. Something they did add to this version is that on the second screen of the DS, you kind of have a map that shows you where the goal is and where you are in relation to it. It also keeps track of how many rupees or rupee shards you have and all that kind of stuff. I really would have preferred if this map actually filled in as you explored instead of staying blank, but I guess at least they used the second screen for something. Knowing where the goal is did make these stages even easier. After you complete a stage, you still get the screen that shows you which character got the most rupees, even though you controlled them both. And I found that kind of weird. The final boss is also significantly harder in single player, and not all of the bosses in this game in general translated well to not having an extra person. Just like the original game, to get the true ending, you actually need to clear through the levels 3 different times, and your second and third playthroughs are much different than your first one. You need to prioritize getting rupees, since you'll need 3,000 and 5,000 rupees respectively during those subsequent playthroughs to clear the levels. Beating a stage fast will net you a big rupee bonus, but exploring every nook and cranny will also reveal a ton more rupees than if you just rush to the end. It's also super important not to die, since dying drains your rupees. Because you're essentially playing the same levels just remixed over and over, it does start to feel a little bit stale by the end. But that being said, the bosses on the second and third playthroughs are a little bit harder with more steps, which did keep it interesting, and the final dungeon is very different on the final attempt. Another new piece of added content is that when you beat the game for the first time, you unlock this bonus stage called the Realm of Memories. This contains levels that are tributes to past Zelda games, such as A Link to the Past, Link's Awakening, and the original Zelda on the NES. I really liked this as a reward. It really makes this game feel almost like a love letter to the previous top-down Zelda games, and it significantly elevates it above the original version on the Game Boy Advance. As someone who has been completing all of the Zelda games and recently played through all of the games that this pays tribute to, this felt really special and was a nice treat. Clearing all the stages in this grants you the Master Sword, which lets you shoot a beam from the sword when you aren't damaged. This was originally an unlock that you would get in Four Swords on the Game Boy Advance by playing A Link to the Past, which was on the same cartridge. But since the two games are no longer linked and this is a standalone title, it's nice that you can still get it. Now, getting to 30,000 total rupees collected also unlocks a hard mode called the Hero's Trial, and clearing this gives you the other ability that you would have gotten from A Link to the Past, a spin attack. While this mode does seem fun at first, it's an extra challenge, I didn't find it particularly important to the overall game. The level designs quickly go from interesting to extremely convoluted, and there's several times in this where it feels like they just throw as many enemies as possible on screen at once. There's also several enemy types that aren't really designed to be defeated in single player, and they'll throw a bunch of them on screen at once, which is really frustrating. It makes this a very difficult task to pull off in single player. It probably took me as much time to beat this mode as everything else in the game combined. Personally, for this reason, I don't recommend completing the Hero's Trial in single player like I did. Other than all that, most of what I said in the review of the original game still stands, but the single player experience was definitely unique and a welcome addition. Unfortunately though, having to beat it 3 times did get a bit old, because even though the stages are randomized, they're extremely similar. I would have preferred to beat 9 different unique levels as opposed to the same 3 levels 3 times to unlock the final dungeon. There's also still the fact that some stages in this game can be cleared in a matter of minutes, and that has not changed. And because of that, some of the stages, especially on your first playthrough, feel extremely brief. All of the extra added content though does help this feel a lot more like a complete package, and this is definitely the definitive version of the game. And while this game is still far from perfect, and kind of a pain to play today as I explained earlier, it does still get an A rank. It's really fun, and the core gameplay mechanics are very solid. It feels like a worthy tribute to the past Legend of Zelda games without feeling overly gimmicky. They really need to port this one to modern consoles with online play because it's really fun and more people deserve to get to experience this one. Here's another one of those games where I had to debate whether or not I should actually include it, but I have seen it pop up on lists about different Legend of Zelda spin-offs, so I decided I'd rather include it as opposed to not including it and having people think I skipped a game. The Legend of Zelda Battle Quest is one of the attractions that's featured in Nintendo Land for the Wii U. Now, if you're not familiar with it, Nintendo Land is a collection of in-depth minigames based on various Nintendo properties. The layout of the game is similar to a theme park. A lot of these attractions are pretty robust, and the different games are pretty long and very intricate. Throughout all of the different attractions that you can play, you take on the role of a Mii, and you get dressed up in a costume associated with the series. For Battle Quest, it's Link's tunic in different colors. The overall aesthetic of the Legend of Zelda Battle Quest actually reminds me of a patchwork quilt, with a lot of the characters looking like dolls or plushies that have been sewn together, and as you attack monsters, stuffing will actually start to pop out. Now, Battle Quest specifically can support up to 5 players, and technically has 3 different game modes for you to conquer. One player will take on the role of the archer, using the Wii U gamepad and its gyroscope controls to aim. The screen on the gamepad itself shows an entirely different view to what is shown on the TV, which allows the player controlling the archer to have their own unobstructed view of the action. You can also look around or reset your view with one of the joysticks on the gamepad, and you use the other joystick to fire your arrows. Holding the joystick down produces a charge shot, which will fly further, do more damage, and has a small explosion upon impact. You have to tilt the gamepad down to restock your arrows, but otherwise you have unlimited ammo. And if someone tries to attack you, you can also use the bumpers to dodge. Generally speaking, I found playing as the archer pretty fun. The controls were very responsive, and you can look around and aim wherever you want. Now, any other players who join in take on the roles of swordsmen, using the Wiimotes as a proxy for the Master Sword. Using the sword never felt as intuitive as the bow, with the motion tracking often going off-center, forcing you to reset it constantly. Holding the sword towards the sky or straight out to the side will charge it up, letting you do a very powerful spin attack. Another thing you can do as the swordsman is raise your shield with the trigger to block incoming attacks, or use the A button to switch between targets, which is probably your most useful ability. Now, regardless of which role you chose, you're pretty much on rails for the entire level, always walking forwards. The only way you can stop moving is either to notch an arrow or to hold up your shield. This was a little bit annoying, especially if you're playing as the swordsman. There are times where an enemy might rush past you to try and attack the archer, and if they get too far away for you to switch your target target to them, there's literally no way for you to pursue them. Not being able to turn around at will or choose where you want to actually go makes the game feel kind of limited. The first mode that I played through is the time trials, which is actually single player only. You play as the archer and you just need to clear through several waves of enemies in the allotted time. There's only 3 courses for this mode and they were all really easy. I cleared each of them on the first try. The second mode, which I would consider the main game mode, is adventure. You work your way through 9 stages that are reimaginings of popular Zelda locations, like the Lost Forest or Death Mountain. They all take between 5 to 15 minutes to clear, and the first few stages were pretty easy. However, the difficulty scales very quickly, with some of the later courses taking more than a dozen tries for us to actually get through. In these courses, you fight your way through different waves of enemies, and occasionally you might have to solve a basic puzzle, like hitting these switches in a specific order or hitting them all simultaneously. At the end of each stage, there's some kind of boss fight, you get the Triforce, see a screen that shows how well you've done, and then you unlock the next stage. When we played this, we quickly learned that because the controls of the sword are so imprecise, you end up missing a lot of hits and taking a ton of damage. The best strategy is to actually have the swordsman run up ahead and pull aggro on all of the different enemies. If you do this and block, none of them will actually be able to land a hit on you, which makes them easy for the archer to pick off at a safe distance. When it comes to the bosses though, the roles were actually reversed for the most part, where usually the archer is the one pulling aggro on the boss monsters so that you can wail on them mercilessly with the sword. The final boss of the normal adventure mode is Ganon, who was a legitimate challenge the first few times we fought him. But like most of the fights in this game, if you put in the time and learn the patterns, you will eventually prevail. Beating Ganon unlocks the third extra mode, which has 5 more adventure type courses to go through. Beating these stages was definitely a challenge because most of them were very long, but only 2 of the 5 gave us any real trouble. Unfortunately, beating these stages doesn't really unlock anything special, just another stamp that counts towards the overall Nintendo Land game. I definitely felt like the role of the archer using the gamepad worked the best and was the most fleshed out. While playing as the swordsman was fun initially, as the difficulty scaled up, the issues with the motion tracking became more and more apparent, causing lots of frustration. Now, to be fair, this was the best motion tracking of a sword that they had managed in a Zelda game to date, but it was still far from perfect. This game was also a lot longer than I would have expected, being that it's just one game mode available in all of Nintendo Land, and because of that, it definitely overstayed its welcome, as the gameplay doesn't contain a ton of variety. With all of that in mind, I'm going to give it a C rank. While there is fun to be had here, it definitely felt a little bit too difficult and overly lengthy without enough variety. With a larger group of friends playing, it might be a more enjoyable experience, but at that point you might as well just play something more fun than this, like Mario Party. If you own this game and own a Wii U, it might be worth checking out for a little while, but it's yet another game on this list where if you skip it, you're really not missing much. And now it's time to sail the seas once again, this time in the HD remake of Wind Waker for the Wii U. Like a lot of the different Legend of Zelda remakes, this one manages to significantly upgrade the visuals and add in a lot of minor tweaks to the gameplay, all of which go a long way in making it a more pleasant experience overall. For a long time, this was my favorite Zelda game, and it was the reason I bought a Wii U back in the day. Plot-wise, it's the exact same as the original game, so while I'll give a brief overview, I'm not going to go into heavy detail here. There's an opening cutscene that provides a bunch of backstory explaining that Hyrule was flooded to protect it from Ganon when the Hero of Time could not be found. Wind Waker then starts you off on Outset Island on Link's birthday. As part of tradition, he receives the classic green tunic that we all associate with the Legend of Zelda series. He then witnesses the pirate Tetra fall from the claws of a giant bird into the nearby forest, and after going to save her, his sister is then kidnapped in her place. Link then teams up with the pirates to save his sister, but finds himself woefully underprepared. Soon after, he joins up with a talking ship called the King of Red Lions to eventually try and get his sister back. He meets up with several of the different denizens of the world, first getting 3 magic orbs that let him unlock a path to the old Hyrule that's under the ocean, and here he manages to get the Master Sword and learns that Tetra is actually this world's version of Zelda. After powering up the sword and freeing his sister, Tetra is then captured, and Link goes on a journey to free her, and this eventually culminates in the defeat of Ganon. After everyone is reunited back on Outset Island, Link then sets off on a new adventure on the open seas. So to start off here, the graphics look gorgeous in this HD remake. In addition to up-resing everything to 1080p, there's also various lighting effects and other small touches that really make the graphics stand out and pop. The music as well sounds even better than I remember, which also made me appreciate just how solid and unique the overall soundtrack was. Control-wise, it has also seen several nice improvements, allowing you to use either the Wii U gamepad or the Wii U Pro controller to play. A lot of the items and whatnot have been remapped to new buttons, and it all feels really intuitive. I also really like how the second screen on the Wii U gamepad allows you to manage your inventory or have a map up at all times. This is similar to a lot of the 3DS Zelda game remakes, and having the map up while you're sailing helps prevent you from getting turned around. Another nice feature is that when you actually play your Wind Waker, the song list is displayed on the gamepad as well. And if you play using the Wii U gamepad, there's also gyroscopic aiming. And even though I'm usually against motion controls, using the gyroscopic aiming to subtly enhance my aim with the bow or the grappling hook felt really intuitive, especially in a post-Breath of the Wild world. Now there's also a whole host of minor quality of life improvements that they've made. When gliding around with the Deku Leaf, there's always now an indicator on the ground showing you where you're going to land. And when firing bombs, you also get a crosshair on your screen to help you aim. And they've even sped up how fast it is to change the wind and dig up treasures. Also, fun fact, as I've beaten this game before, I actually have the second quest unlocked, which is what I played for most of this review. In the second quest, you actually get to wear around your original outfit the entire time. Also, text that was previously indecipherable in the original game is now translated for you. You start off with a wallet that can hold 500 rupees, which is super helpful. You can also get the deluxe Picto Box really easily when you reach Windfall, which saves a lot of time. As well, on the second quest, all of your figurines from previous playthroughs will carry over, and the figurine maker can also now accept and make 12 figurines per day. That really helps speed up that entire side mission, although I do still think it's mostly pointless to do, as there's no real reward for completing it other than a special figurine. Possibly one of the biggest and most impactful changes to the game, however, is the addition of the Swift Sail. The Swift Sail allows you to travel on the ocean at what feels like double speed compared to normal in any direction, and it's not affected by which way the wind is blowing. This managed to significantly reduce travel time, which was one of my biggest complaints with the original game. And the changing the wind mechanic isn't completely abandoned either, because you have to still use it for a lot of puzzles. One of the few things present in the original game that was actually removed in this remaster is the Tingle Tuner. In the remaster, instead of the Tingle Tuner, you get a bottle that you can use to send messages using the now defunct Miiverse. Wind Waker has some very unique mechanics that are all its own, and they really shine through in this version. The puzzles were all still fun, and I really like how unique some of them are to this entry. For example, using the boomerang to cut down this flower, and then the Deku Leaf to use gusts of wind to propel it forwards. Wind Waker also has some of the best dungeons in the series, even though not every single one is a winner. Sadly, there are only a handful of them though. A lot of the bosses are still very unique and just the right level of challenging all the way up until the end of the game. Thanks to the increased travel speed, I was actually able to blaze through this game and 100% complete it, including all of the side content, in significantly less time than it took me to just beat the original game. I definitely have a lot of love for Wind Waker, and while I do still think it has too many minigames, side quests, and collectibles for its own good, the core gameplay and story are very satisfying, leading me to give this version of the game an S rank. Wind Waker HD is a great example of just how much minor changes and tweaks can massively improve games that are already very solid. For the longest time, Wind Waker was definitely a misunderstood classic, and the HD version really helps it shine, presenting a game that is a wholly unique experience and definitely worth playing, even if as of right now you still have to own a Wii U to do so. Next up on the list here is A Link Between Worlds for the 3DS, a direct sequel to A Link to the Past on the Super Nintendo, taking place in the same world but hundreds of years later. So the game starts off with Link being awoken from a nightmare, and then realizing that he's late, he runs off to the blacksmith where he works as an apprentice. The captain of the guard forgets his sword, so Link is tasked with delivering it to him, but when you reach the sanctuary where this captain is supposed to be, the big bad of this game, Yuga, appears and transforms both the captain of the guard and a descendant of one of the sages into a painting. Link then wakes up back in his home with a new house guest named Ravio, who asks Link if he can stay there, and then gifts him with a special bracelet. Link is then tasked with warning another descendant of the sages of old. This one actually ignores his warning and is ultimately also captured by Yuga, and after Link battles him, Yuga then turns Link into a painting as well as a punishment for troubling him. Thanks to the bracelet he was given, Link is actually able to pop out of the painting and walls at will. You then go on a quest to get 3 pendants in order to obtain the Master Sword, and when you do, you face off against Yuga in his homeworld of Lorule, but he appears to still be too powerful to be defeated. The princess of this world, Hilda, jumps in and helps you escape from Yuga's clutches, and then she puts you on a path to save the different sages, all of whom have been turned into paintings, and then ultimately get back a piece of the Triforce to use it to defeat Yuga once and for all. Visually, this game looks pretty solid for a 3DS title, and overall it feels silky smooth to play. The characters in particular look really good, and so do a lot of the boss monsters. The only HUD elements on the top screen are your health bar and energy, with everything else including maps, items, and gear being delegated to the bottom screen. Gameplay-wise, it draws a lot from the previous titles, feeling right at home in the pantheon of Zelda games. The controls all feel super tight, various functions are mapped to specific buttons like running, swinging your sword, or blocking attacks, and there's also several buttons that you can freely map your different items to. You spend most of your time clearing through various dungeons full of puzzles, some of which will provide you with special items that allow you to progress, although the vast majority of items that you get in this game are actually courtesy of Ravio, who completely takes over Link's house and uses it as a shop, and here you're actually able to rent items from him for a fee, and they're yours to use as long as you don't die. Eventually, you are able to buy these different items from Ravio for a large fee, and this also opens up the ability of being able to upgrade them. The only real collectibles to worry about in A Link Between Worlds are the usual heart pieces, and a bunch of these lost creatures called Mai Mai, and bringing the Mai Mai back to their mother is actually what allows you to upgrade the items. The map is extremely similar to the one in A Link to the Past, but as hundreds of years have passed in this world, there are some areas that are pretty different. This game's version of the Dark World, Lorule, is radically different from what was seen in A Link to the Past, but it does still follow the geography of the main world of Hyrule, which means it was always pretty easy to navigate. Lorule also features characters who are counterparts to those in normal Hyrule, for example Hilda, who is Zelda's opposite. You can enter Lorule or return to Hyrule using these rifts that you can find throughout the world, and certain areas are actually blocked off, requiring you to hop between the two to actually reach them, and this forces you to explore every nook and cranny of the map. I really liked this as it made the two realms feel very connected. There is also a fast travel mechanic thanks to this witch who flies you around on her broom, and she'll bring you to any of the save points that you've activated, which are represented by weather vanes. One other unique aspect of this game is that the majority of the dungeons, save for a select few, can actually be done in any order as long as you have the right items with you. The dungeons themselves are all fairly quick and concise. Link's ability to slide onto walls is usually used to great effect, and so are the various items that you'll have in your inventory, meaning a lot of the puzzles felt super inventive and fun to do, and unlike anything else I'd seen in the series so far. The bosses were also usually really fun, always having a specific mechanic that once you master, you're good to go. There was a really nice variety to them, with many from A Link to the Past returning, but also some new additions to the roster. And something else that I very much enjoyed about this game is that the sages you rescue are all people that you meet in the game earlier, which reminds me a lot of Ocarina of Time, and it helps make you, the player, more invested in saving them. So after having beaten all of the different dungeons and saved each of the 7 sages, Link is then able to claim the Triforce of Courage, after which he goes on to storm Lorule Castle to try and free Zelda and stop Yuga's plan. After fighting your way through the castle and defeating several bosses from previous dungeons, you'll eventually reach Hilda, who is standing in front of Zelda's portrait. She then reveals that the world of Lorule actually once had its own Triforce, but it was destroyed long ago, and ever since then the realm has been in ruin. Hilda then reveals that she's actually been the mastermind behind the entire plot, with Yuga doing her bidding, orchestrating everything so that Link would obtain the piece of the Triforce, which she intends to take for herself. Hilda then summons a version of Yuga who seems to be merged with Ganon and actually possesses the Triforce of Power, after which a battle ensues between Yuga and Link. Yuga then ignores Hilda's orders and instead absorbs the Triforce of Wisdom for himself, intending to remake the world in his image. Eventually, Yuga is defeated thanks to the help of Zelda and her light arrows. Ravio suddenly appears, removing his hood and revealing himself to be the Lorule counterpart of Link. Hilda comes to her senses and promises not to attempt such a plot again. Zelda and Link use the power of the Triforce to restore Lorule, flooding it with light, and after this, the credits play. Link is seen returning the Master Sword to the pedestal in the Lost Woods before walking away, peace having been restored to both realms. A Link Between Worlds is as close to perfect as I've seen when it comes to a top-down Zelda game. That isn't to say that I have zero complaints with it. I do find that some of the minigames are more of a pain than they are fun, and there are a lot more Mai Mai to collect than I would like, and the game does start to feel a bit easy by the end with the exception of the final boss fight, but these are all pretty minor complaints compared to all the different things that this game does right. With all of that in mind, it actually takes my top S rank spot, knocking A Link to the Past down one. A Link Link Between Worlds is an extremely fun, polished, and satisfying experience, with tons of replayability and different ways to approach the various dungeons, puzzles, monsters, and bosses. While this is not an overly long title, there's definitely still plenty of game to sink your teeth into. I think it has more than earned its place at the top of the list, and I definitely recommend that Zelda fans play it. So what happens if you combine the basic story elements and characters of a Legend of Zelda game with the combat and gameplay of a Dynasty Warriors game? The result is Hyrule Warriors, a game that came out on the Wii U, 3DS, and Nintendo Switch. I did debate on whether or not I needed to cover the different versions of this game, but from the research that I did and having played all three of them, they're virtually the exact same game, just with some minor gameplay differences and tweaks. The 3DS and Wii U versions both had DLC released, but the Nintendo Switch version, which is called the Definitive Edition, has all of that content in it. There are a lot of different game modes for you to sink your teeth into in Hyrule Warriors, with the first one being called Legend Mode, which is basically the story mode. So plot-wise, there's an evil sorceress named Sia who became obsessed with the legend of the Hero of Time, and she then used her dark powers to try and take control of Hyrule, opening up portals to different time periods and flooding the world with monsters. You initially take control of Link, who gets noticed by Zelda and Impa during a training practice, and you're basically clearing through several different stages trying to get to Sia. At a certain point, the story actually diverges into 3 different paths, with teams of characters entering different time portals to defeat the enemies there and seal the portal. And all of the characters meet back up for what should be the final showdown against Sia, although as it turns out, there's a lot more game beyond that. Aesthetically, Hyrule Warriors does a pretty good job with the different characters. There are even some characters who are in 3D for the very first time, or who look better than they did in their original entries, and that's pretty impressive for them to have pulled off successfully. All that being said though, their original characters like Lana or Sia stick out like a sore thumb, looking very much like something out of the latest anime. The environments themselves also don't look particularly impressive, which is a shame because you'll be visiting the same ones over and over. The gameplay is very different from any of the other Legend of Zelda titles, and I should also probably note that while I have played a tiny bit of Dynasty Warriors, I'm pretty unfamiliar with the series as a whole. The main gameplay loop involves fighting various waves of enemies in order to claim an area for your faction. However, the enemies also have the ability to retake these keeps as well. While plenty of areas can change hands back and forth, if you lose your main base, it's game over. In addition to claiming keeps for your side, there's also mini-boss battles against other characters or well-known monsters from the Legend of Zelda franchise. For example, Manhandla, Dodongos, dragons, and more. I actually really appreciated that the way to beat these enemies always follows how it was in the original game. Another big aspect of the gameplay is escorting characters from place to place and protecting them. Very often, a specific character will need to get to a certain keep to trigger an event, or a bunch of strong monsters will be dispatched to try and capture them, and you need to protect them during all this. While initially you can only play as Link, by the end of Legend Mode, you will have unlocked a large cast of characters. Each of these has a different combat style and feels very unique when playing as them. You can pull off combos by chaining certain attacks together with specific button inputs, and you also have a special move, and each of these characters can also be upgraded through the use of badges, which are unlocked by materials that you pick up in-game by defeating certain enemies. Each character can then be further customized by choosing their weapon type, and then there's also cosmetic outfits. On some maps, you have more than one playable character that you can switch between, and when you're not controlling them, they'll also continue to fight, although not particularly well. So I think that the combat in this game is probably its strongest aspect. I really like how differently the cast of characters feel to use, and being able to swap which character you're controlling means that if you don't particularly like a certain one, you can usually opt out of having to play them. On the flip side, where I feel like this game mode fails the most is when it comes to the non-playable characters that you have to watch over. Escort missions are never fun in any game, and pretty much every level of Hyrule Warriors is littered with them. You also have to constantly babysit the main keeps that you control. There's also always so much going on screen at once, with keeps being lost and retaken, mini-boss monsters being defeated, side missions popping up and disappearing, and non-stop character dialogue, to the point that it's really hard to keep track of what's going on, and important notifications can be delayed by a huge amount of time. If you follow the story, eventually it is revealed that Sia and your ally Lana are both the same person, just split into their light and dark halves, and that Ganon was the puppet master behind the scenes controlling Sia, using her to get back 4 pieces of his spirit so that he could be revived. Sia eventually turns on Ganon, and then after you defeat her, you learn that the entire reason that she went evil was because she saw the future and saw that Link did not want to be with Lana and chose Zelda instead. Right now is also when I should mention that the plot of this game is considered non-canon, and quite honestly, it feels like playing through someone's Tumblr fanfiction. Eventually, this game does come to an end after you've defeated Ganon, saved the castle again as Linkle, and then saved the entire cast of Wind Waker, but when this mode ends, there's still a lot more game left. The next game mode I'll cover is Free Mode, which is pretty simple. It just lets you replay all of the levels from Legend Mode that you've unlocked, but using any character that you want, which is good if you want to farm materials as some are map specific. Adventure Mode has a bunch of overworld maps based on previous Legend of Zelda titles, and each square of this map will have a scenario with a small challenge for you to beat. There's actually a bunch of unlockable characters that you can only get through this mode. There's maps based on everything from Majora's Mask to A Link Between Worlds and anything they could think of in between. This mode was really fun in short bursts, and I actually enjoyed it a lot more than the Legends mode. But it does force you to play as characters that you don't really like for various challenges, and as well, there's just way too many map squares because of all that DLC. In Adventure Mode, you'll also come across something called a Companion Fairy, which unlocks another mode in this game, where you're able to customize your fairies with different gear and abilities and feed them food in order to raise their stats. They'll then aid you in battle and give you buffs, for example, reviving you if you're killed. The final mode to talk about is Challenge Mode, which is pretty much what it sounds like. There's a bunch of different challenges that are pretty similar to the ones that you find in Adventure Mode, just a lot longer. You do also get to play as two secret characters in this mode, Dark Beast Ganon or a Giant Cuckoo. Playing as them is hands down the worst part of the entire game. Instead of Beast Ganon being an all-powerful being like he should be, you instead move around a character that's as slow as an elephant and just button mash for 15 minutes until the level ends. Any of the tiny characters that have a health bar can almost one-shot you with a well-placed combo. I was so incredibly bored doing this part, and I had to replay levels over and over because something like a basic Lizalfos would take me out with one hit right near the end. This was incredibly lengthy for what it was, and while I think the idea was great, the execution was just terrible. So all in all, I think Hyrule Warriors is a very cool experiment, but it fails on so many fronts for me that I can't really recommend it. The only part of it that I truly had fun with was the Adventure Mode, but Adventure Mode is so insanely bloated as a result of all the DLC that even that fun wore off pretty quickly. Legend Mode was okay, but the story and the mechanics just didn't really jive with me. So with all of that in mind, Hyrule Warriors Definitive Edition gets a low C rank for me. If you're looking for something vastly different from any of the mainline Legend of Zelda games, then you might find this game pretty fun, but if you don't have experience with the Dynasty Warriors series and are looking to fully beat everything that this game has to offer, or even worse, try and 100% complete it, I would probably steer clear. It's also completely non-canon, so you won't really be missing anything if you decide to skip this one. Now it's time to cover the remake of Majora's Mask on the 3DS called Majora's Mask 3D. Unlike the remake of Ocarina of Time, which had minimal changes overall, for this game there was a very concerted effort to fix the many issues that plagued the original and to try and offer a more polished experience. And having a chance to revisit an improved version was something that got me really excited because I think the issues that plagued the original could be smoothed out to offer a more enjoyable experience overall. So the plot is the exact same as the N64 version, with Link getting all of his possessions stolen by Skull Kid and then cursed into the form of a Deku Scrub. After teaming up with the fairy who was left behind, he then goes on to get his ocarina back from Skull Kid and uses it to create a time loop, returning him to the very first day he arrived in Termina. The happy mask salesman then turns him back into his human form, but asks that he gets Majora's Mask back, which Skull Kid had stolen from him. Because of the actions of Skull Kid, the moon is going to crash into the world in 3 days, ending everything. As a result, you go on an adventure to 4 different temples across the land, freeing the 4 giants. After solving the issues of the entire village and then some, you face off against Skull Kid, and the 4 giants actually hold up the moon, preventing the apocalypse. You then discover that the mask itself had been controlling Skull Kid the entire time, and after defeating Majora and returning the mask to its rightful owner, Link then sets off for a new adventure while the town celebrates behind him. So first off, the graphics look really good for a 3DS game. In fact, this might be the best looking game on this handheld that I've played to date. They really managed to capture the the look and feel of the original game while also updating everything to look a lot more clear and readable. And thankfully, they didn't lose the dark and creepy aesthetic in the process. The sound as well is top-notch, with every song sounding as good as I remember. Control-wise, it feels mostly good to play, with most of the features from the Ocarina of Time remake also making an appearance here. So while you don't have the C buttons from the N64 controller, you do get 2 virtual buttons that you can press on the bottom screen of the 3DS, and this works fine for items that you aren't constantly using. The Ocarina also has a dedicated button, and I really like that when you play it, you can view the different songs on the bottom screen so that you don't have to memorize them. And what is probably the biggest improvement to this game actually relates to the Ocarina. In the original game, using the Song of Double Time, you could skip ahead to the next day. However, in the remake, you can actually use this song to skip ahead to an exact time down to the hour. This manages to eliminate a huge amount of waiting around that was present in the N64 version, and it really just makes for an overall quicker and smoother experience playing through this, especially if you're going for all of those side quests and rewards. The second screen of the 3DS functions as your inventory of items, masks, and gear, and it also lets you view the map constantly, which is super helpful in some of the more confusing areas like the water dungeon. They also changed how saving works in this game, and while you still can't save anywhere you want, there's now designated save points all around the map and even inside of the dungeons. And this is the main way to save the game now, instead of having to reset the time loop and return to the first day. The Bomber's Notebook is also given to you immediately when you regain your human form by the Happy Mask Salesman, and this lets you enjoy its benefits right away. Now, there's also a slew of minor gameplay tweaks, and while I'm not going to cover all of them, a few that really stood out to me were making the water where you need to shoot an ice arrow in the water temple now sparkle, or allowing you to hot swap from one of your key masks to another without having to turn back into Link first. That being said, there are some tweaks they made that I didn't find quite so great. For example, I found the controls for the Zora and Goron forms a bit problematic in this remake, especially when you're swimming with the Zora form or trying to Goron roll on very small platforms. They also made the boss of the last dungeon super long and tedious to defeat, and while the final boss was pretty easy in the N64 version if you get the Fierce Deity mask, in the remake Majora literally went down in a matter of seconds, which felt pretty unsatisfying. There's also still a million minigames to complete throughout Majora's Mask, and while generally speaking I found them easier to do than in the original, it's still far too many for its own good. And they even added a new fishing minigame which rewards you with nothing for completing it. I also still think that the masks overall in this game never really reached their full potential, and it's kind of a missed opportunity. For example, if you look at my inventory here, these masks that I have highlighted are super useful and I use them almost constantly. These ones here are still used occasionally, and these ones here are basically only ever used once or twice and otherwise completely forgotten about. There's only 4 real dungeons in Majora's Mask, with a few mini dungeons thrown in for good measure, and while I don't think this game has the strongest dungeons in the Legend of Zelda series, what we do get is pretty well designed. And something that I touched on in my review of the N64 game, but I actually came to appreciate a lot more this time through, is your ability to see the different outcomes of events depending on which actions you take. For example, saving this old woman on the first night will let you get the large bomb bag, but if you let her get robbed instead, you'll actually open up an entirely different quest line down the road. The characters themselves are still where this game really shines, with so many memorable people popping up along your journey. The best quest in the game, in my opinion, is the one where you help Anju and Cafe get married. There are a lot of really good side quests focused on different characters, but this one really stood out to me. While Majora's Mask has always had a great story, this remake really manages to elevate the gameplay to a point where it manages to almost catch up. And honestly, almost every issue that I had with the original is solved here, although it did introduce a few new problems of its own, mainly in terms of the controls. That being said, this is absolutely the definitive way to play this game, and thanks to all of the great improvements, I would actually bump this game up to an S rank, though it would probably be at the bottom of the S rank bracket. To enjoy Majora's Mask, you definitely need to accept it on its own terms and play it the way that it wants you to, but once you wrap your head around that, it's an overall pleasant experience from start to finish. If you disliked the original, this version is probably not going to win you over, but if you like the N64 version or have never played it at all, the 3DS remake is the clear choice to experience Majora's Mask. I had a ton of fun 100% completing this one, and it's one of the few games that I've reviewed in this series where I'll probably do so again in the future. Alright, so that about does it for this video. A huge thank you to everyone who is watching this series. I very much appreciate it, and it's super fun. There will be 2 more videos to come. The first one will be covering the games 41 to 50, and then a final marathon video that has every single game in it, as well as the newest release, Echoes of Wisdom. That's going to be a very long video. Anyways, though, thank you so much for tuning in. I hope you enjoyed. I'd love to hear your thoughts down in the comments below, and hopefully I'll catch you in the next one. Take care, everyone.